This is a lecture by Jess Gilbert, co-sponsored by the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems and the Agroecology 702 class. And I am first going to turn things over to Michelle Watteau, who is the interim director of the Center for Integrated Ag Systems, to give us a welcome. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation to come and share a little bit about CIS to the participant of today's lecture. So as Sarah said, CIS is the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems, and it's a center in the College of Ag that really aspire to fulfill the Wisconsin idea. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. You know, the Wisconsin idea says that, you know, whatever we do at the university should serve, and I would emphasize, all the people of the state and even beyond. So how do we do that? Well, CIS is built on three interrelated pillars of kind that are all in line with the Wisconsin idea and also contribute very uniquely to the mission of the College of Ag and Life Sciences, that is. So first, what we do at the center is multidisciplinary, and maybe I should even say transdisciplinary rather than multidisciplinary. But the big things really that set us apart from many other units in the college is that we are really bridging the social sciences with the natural sciences and try to bring a happy family around the idea of bridging those two worlds that are too often too far apart in my perspective. The second thing that we do that I think is pretty unique at CIS is that, you know, our research and our extension efforts are sometimes one and the same. And we call it community engagement. It means, for example, that we really at CIS value farmer participation and not just, you know, out of lip services, but really try to engage them from the very beginning in the kind of work that we do, because eventually they are the beneficiaries of those, the outcome of those projects, and without their initial input into it, we may not get the full benefits of this kind of work. A poignant example of this is that, you know, our governance structure and our work, again, is inclusive of farmers' voice, because we do have what we call the Citizen Advisory Council, we call it the CAC, which is a group of farmers and agribusiness people who help guide us about our work. And obviously give us also inputs of what's going on out in the state. So again, we're trying to create two-way streets as opposed to multiple one-line roads kind of thing. And finally, the third thing that makes us pretty unique, I think, in the college is that we're really working at the system level. You know, I mentioned, you know, the transdisciplinary work, but when I refer to systems level, I really refer to basically the thematic priorities of the college, you know, related to rural development and sustainability, food systems, and healthy ecosystems. So I think this is a very brief introduction to what CIS is all about. If you're more interested in knowing more, we got a brand new website, which is still partially in construction, and it's very easy to Google it, cis.wiz.edu, and you'll learn more about CIS. And having said that, I'll turn it back to Sarah, and thank you again, Sarah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. And this is a co-hosted event with the Agroecology 702 course. My name is Sarah Lloyd, and I'm the instructor this semester in the Agroecology 702 class. It's a class about the multifunctionality of agriculture. And this semester, we are taking a deeper dive into participatory action research methods. And so not only are we learning together the day-to-day activities and action methods, but we're also thinking at the next levels up to the meta, which is why we wanted to bring Jess Gilbert in, because he was thinking about and has been thinking about, you know, how could these sort of participatory community and democratic processes be institutionalized, be systematized. And so that's what 702 is part of the master's program in agroecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And there's a great cohort. So if you haven't checked out the agroecology program, it brings people in from all across the nation and even the world to participate. So this is part of our normal class meeting, but we wanted to throw a party and invite everybody else to join us today to hear from Jess about his great book. So a quick word about Jess Gilbert. Dr. Jess Gilbert is an emeritus professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Community and Environmental Sociology Department. Doug Constance is holding up his book. I've got one too. And Jess really spent his time as a faculty member and researcher looking deeply at the structures of agriculture, at the farmer viability, at land tenure, land access. I first came into know his work because he did some really important comparisons in the structure of the Wisconsin dairy farm system, the farm production structure with that of California, and really important research. And I was able to take a graduate seminar with him, and I see some of my fellow students here on the call who have gone off to other universities or are at the USDA now working. And we wanted to bring Jess in today to talk about planning democracy, agrarian intellectuals, and the intended New Deal. So we are very glad to have him here. Just a quick note, we will be having time for Q&A at the end of the session. We've given Dr. Gilbert about 45 minutes to present his book and his ideas. The students from 702 will be managing the chat and looking for questions. We will kick things off with a couple questions that we generated from the class conversation we had on Tuesday, and then we will facilitate taking questions from the whole group assembled here. So you can type those in the chat. And also we'll be explaining after Jess wraps up just exactly how we'll be taking questions. We also can let you unmute yourself and say your question too when the time comes. And just so you know, the plan is to have Jess present, do the Q&A till around 3:30, 3:35-ish Central Time. And then we can hang out longer if people want to hang out and chat. If we want to go into breakout rooms to talk about specific issues, we can do that. But that's the plan. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Dr. Jess Gilbert.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, very much. I probably won't take 45 minutes, just as a warning, so we could have time for more questions. I notice a namesake on the screen, Jessica Gilbert. That's my middle child. Hi, Katie. So I'm glad to have some family people here. Yeah, I want to thank you, especially Sarah, for inviting me to do this and your agroecology class and Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems. I remember when that was founded back in the day, and it's been doing wonderful work in CALS and at UW-Madison in general. It's also great to see a lot of old friends, names at least, and so I look forward to talking and perhaps having a discussion at the end. So I want to talk today about the main program I discuss in my book called Planning Democracy. It's an agricultural program of the New Deal Department of Agriculture. And it really put forth something new in American history. For the first time, a group of representative citizens, here we're talking about farmers, got together with scientists and researchers, adult educators, mainly through the Extension Service, and government administrators. All of those groups together, citizens, administrators, researchers, and educators, to form and reform public policy. That had really never happened before and still is rare. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to lay out what I'll be doing. First of all, I want to specify what I mean by democracy in the title of the book, and what the figures in my book meant by democracy. So I'll talk about that. And then 3 particular current political, theoretical issues that are raised around that notion of democracy. Secondly, I want to give an overview of the New Deal. I'm going to break this into what everybody knows about the New Deal, the known New Deal, so to speak, and then transition to the unknown New Deal, which is what I focus on in the book. It's a very little studied program late in the New Deal, late 30s and early 40s. And I just want to set the context of what it was trying to do. Thirdly, I want to focus on 2 particular emphases of the program. Since the agroecology course is focused on participatory action research, I want to indicate one of the pioneering efforts of PAR in this Department of Agriculture effort I'll be focusing on. In other words, participatory action research was one of the main themes, main activities of the program I'll be discussing. And related to that, I want to summarize one particular case, an exemplary case of action planning of the outcomes of the policy I'll be focusing on. And then I'll say some general words in conclusion about political and theoretical issues. So let me start with democracy. Of course, democracy is a major value in American society, in American history. And typically, we mean by that political democracy, where people vote periodically for representatives, for leaders to make government policy. And that kind of political democracy is extremely important. In fact, the last 4 or 5 years, we've become reminded of the importance of leaders in our country and the difference it makes as to who is in leadership positions. However, the kind of democracy I'm talking about is not simply formal or representative. Rather, it's different words have been used to describe it: strong democracy, thick democracy, deep democracy, a richer concept, a more radical sense of democracy that involves substantive citizen participation in directing public life. In particular, by democracy, I mean the increasing power and resources to non-elites. That is a redistribution of power and resources to common people away from the 1% or the 5% or the 10%. The term common in the 1930s was economic democracy. It's the idea of taking the principles of political democracy, where you vote and determine and influence leaders, taking the principles of political democracy and applying that to the economy is one way to talk about it, so that people affected by a decision have some hand in making that decision ideally. This, again, both the agrarian intellectuals, who I'll specify in a moment, that are the leaders of the US Department of Agriculture during the New Deal, and hundreds and thousands of other people in the 1930s were talking and advocating this more radical sense of democracy or economic democracy. The favorite philosopher of the people I write about was John Dewey, who was a radical democratic theorist. And I spend some time in the book talking about his contribution to the thinking of the agrarian intellectuals. Ruth Benedict, a cultural anthropologist, was also heavily influential on the people I'll be talking about. And so it wasn't even simply economic democracy, but both educational democracy, cultural democracy, sort of expanding the notion of citizen participation into every aspect of social or public life. The idea was to have a participative society that maximizes individual and group involvement in public issues. It's somewhat similar to the notion of participatory democracy of the 1960s, the radical student and other movements of the 1960s of the New Left. The big difference being the New Left were anti-big state, right? They were opposed to Lyndon Johnson in many ways. They wanted everything to be local. And the people I'm writing about were statist. They were big state New Dealers, right? So they did not see a contradiction between being federal bureaucrats on the one hand and being participatory Democrats on the other. So that gives, I hope, some sense of the way I'll be using the term democracy. The people who held this radical view of democracy, I call agrarian intellectuals in the subtitle of my book. I just mentioned three of them, the three main leaders of the Department of Agriculture. The Secretary of Agriculture in the New Deal, Henry A. Wallace, who became vice president in 1941 and ran an ill-fated campaign for president in 1948. So Henry Wallace is the main agrarian intellectual I'm focusing on. The Undersecretary of Agriculture was M.L. Wilson, who is a proud UW grad in agricultural economics. And he was really the main ideas person behind all this democratization in the Department of Agriculture. I detail it in the book, but won't mention it here, but he invented many, many programs to involve farmers and rural citizens in the affairs of state. So he was a philosopher as well as an economist, and was strongly influenced by John Dewey. He called himself a rip-snorting pragmatist. The third person I'll mention is Howard Tolley, who's the leading economist of the New Deal Department of Agriculture. And he led the main agency within USDA, the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, which started and implemented this program I'll be talking about. So there are others that I talk about in the book. I create a little collective biography of, they're all Midwestern farm boys born in the 1880s. Half of them, a lot of them, come to Madison in the teens and early 20s for graduate school in agricultural economics. I'm not going to focus on that part of it, but there's a long chapter where I detail their graduate careers and early professional careers as agricultural economists. Again, heavily influenced by the teachers and the Wisconsin idea at the University of Wisconsin. So these are the people, Henry Wallace, M.L. Wilson, and others, who intended to foment, to encourage, to create a planning democracy across rural America. I want to just mention briefly three sort of theoretical and political issues that they thought could be addressed by more citizen participation. John Dewey had a saying, the solution to every problem of democracy is more democracy. So Wallace and Wilson and the others thought that these following three issues in particular could be addressed. They can't be solved really, but can be addressed by more citizen participation in the affairs of state. The first issue is the divide between scientist and citizen, or experts of any type and citizens. And this, of course, is what participatory action research tries to do, is to decrease the split between experts on the one hand with their research methods and so on, and the felt needs and desires and plans of everyday citizens, in this case, mainly farmers. So the expert citizen split is the first issue that they tried to address directly. The second one, common in the country, is the national local split, right? And so we have our local government, municipalities, and then there's the far distant federal government. And they, as I will detail later, they thought there were ways that the division between national and local could be bridged. The third thing, sort of summarizing the split that they sought directly to address, is the idea of bureaucracy and democracy. So again, they thought that the bureaucratic state could be used to advance democratic ends. With citizen participation, this is what they call democratic planning. So again, I could sort of reverse the title and called it planning democracy, but it's the notion of involving citizens in planning public policy. So that's my sort of theoretical introduction. Let me turn now to the second part to address, give an overview of the New Deal in agriculture itself. So I'll start with a brief summary of the known New Deal. There were many, many programs, alphabet agencies, you all know of TVA and so on. I'm going to just focus on three of the major programs of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. First, both in timing chronologically and in importance, was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, the AAA. This is the agency in FDR's first 100 days that started providing subsidies to farmers in order to cut back production. This is the agency we still have today. This is what gives billions of dollars to a million or so farmers. Today it's called the Farm Service Agency, but it's basically the same agency that started in 1933. So that was the first one to deal with amount of output that farmers produced. The second very innovative agency was the Soil Conservation Service. Today, this is called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Again, dealing with the technical aspects, for the most part, of trying to conserve soil and water. These are related to the quasi-governmental agencies called the Soil and Water Conservation Districts that many of you know about. So you've got agricultural adjustment to control production by subsidizing farmers. You've got soil conservation efforts with technical experts, engineers, and economists and others working to preserve the soil and the water resources. The third agency is the Farm Security Administration, which was the poor people's agency of the Department of Agriculture. You may know of this from John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. When the Joads get out to California, they go to a farm labor camp of the Farm Security Administration. You also know of it through the iconic photographs of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Margaret Burke White documenting visually the situation of rural Americans. So these are the three main agencies that everybody knows something about. And in addition to that, I mentioned the TVA, there's Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA co-ops that exist today. And many of you, or some of you are probably members of your local electric co-op. So all these very innovative programs were started in 1933 or 1935. Now, even my brief description of them indicates that some may be working at cross purposes, even contradictory goals. They were uncoordinated. They were confusing to individual farmers because these are all separate bureaucracies, separate agencies that have representatives in every county of the country. So this started, as I say, in the first 100 days of the New Deal in 1933. 4 or 5 years later, Henry Wallace and M.L. Wilson and others realized a lot through farmer feedback that there were contradictions, that there were confusions, that there was need for coordination. And that's when they started the program I'm focusing on, the unknown New Deal agricultural program. So in 1938, they began the program I'll be focusing on the rest of my talk, that is called the Cooperative Land Use Planning Program, Cooperative Land Use Planning. This was a national network of local organizations. Again, think about that, a national network of local organizations at the community and county level to integrate and unify, or to localize and coordinate the federal rural policies that I just summarized. So it didn't introduce any more action agencies, so to speak, but it was a overall coordinating mechanism, focused mainly at the county level. So these county committees consisted of a majority of farm men and women, 15 to 20, say, in a county, with the extension agent, the adult educator, with researchers from the State Land Grant College, like in Madison, of course, with the program administrators of these very federal agencies. I did not mention, but many of you know, all of the New Deal agencies, the AAA, the Soil Conservation Service, the Farm Security Administration, the REA, all of them operate not in centralized fashion from Washington, but are decentralized to the county. So they're federal employees of each of these agencies in the county working to implement their separate agency and bureaucracy. The goal, again, of the Cooperative County Land Use Planning Program was to integrate and unify these disparate efforts at the county level into one that makes sense in a synthetic fashion. So this was the planning, was bringing together citizens, farmers, farm people, with the experts who are actually implementing the program on the one hand, the administrators, the adult educators, the extension people, and researchers as needed from the local land grant college. To inform this planning effort, cooperative planning as it was called, there was a major educational effort. The first thing that happened when a county was organized was a year or so spent on what is planning, what is democracy, who should be in control, a discussion program for farmers, usually in the winter, in the off season, to advance a better understanding of adult education. This was an amazing program. They even set up, Sarah, you'd be interested to know, and others, a week-long school of philosophy for extension workers. So it sounds kind of odd, and people thought it was odd, but extension agents would come into the land grant college like Madison and be exposed to major thinkers in the country. Again, Ruth Benedict, Robert Lind, sociologist, all sorts of major social scientists and historians to broaden the perspective of technical workers. So you had the educational effort. The second thing to support the planning was the participatory action research. Again, I'll be talking about that in more detail in a minute. But just to summarize this part, by 1941, 3 years after the program started, by 1941, 3/4 of all rural counties in the country had this cooperative land use planning program. And it included over 200,000 farm men and women at the local level, at the community and county level. Over 200,000 farm men and women served on these local local committees as planners, along with the researchers and the educators and the administrators who are actually implementing the program. The program assumed that both farmers and government experts, both local and federal, both bottom up and top down, were necessary for a richer, deeper democracy. And that's the idea behind democratic planning, theoretically speaking, that the Agrarian Intellectuals implemented in this late New Deal program. Again, they referred to it as democratic planning institutionalized in the cooperative land use program. So it tried to overcome in practice, not in theory. These are not professors interested in developing theory for social science. They're on the ground administrators. They tried to overcome in practice these three paradoxes or dualisms or antinomies that I mentioned earlier. The scientist-citizen split through participatory action research. Experts working with local farmers. The second issue, the federal-local division. Farmers were organized by rural sociologists and agricultural economists at the community level. It was called From Neighborhood to Nation, whereby every group of farmers were represented physically, and I'll get into this in a minute, were represented as part of the county on that county committee. So this is, again, the national network of local committees. And the third issue that they thought could be addressed was a bureaucracy-democracy issue. The Agrarian Intellectuals and the Cooperative Land Use Planning Program used state functions for a democratic ends, that is administration, adult education, applied research, planning, policymaking. They thought all of these things that states do, all modern states do those things. They believed, Henry Wallace and others, that these state or bureaucratic functions could be democratized. Now, those of you who are sociologists may know the name Max Weber. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, he thought this was impossible. That you cannot democratize a bureaucracy. They're two different things. They work in different ways. They cannot be joined. And John Dewey, on the other hand, thought that they could be. And so the Agrarian Intellectuals in this program, in its main effort, was to democratize the state, basically. Now, of course, they didn't solve these paradoxes. They did not solve these dualisms. They're still with us today. That's why what we're talking about may have some relevance. They did not solve them, but they did address these issues directly and innovatively, believing that a state could be democratized, or even in a democratizing state that could help democratize society. Again, this is not a common view, and certainly not a view of many sociologists, but they thought it could be done, and indeed, to their eyes, it was done. It was operational on the ground in rural America with 200,000 farm men and women participating in 1941 in 3/4 of all rural counties in the country. So that's my overview and contextualization of the program. Let me now turn to a couple of details or specifics of the program. First of all, I want to talk a little more, tell you a little more about what they did in terms of participatory action research or community-based research. And then I want to summarize one example, one exemplary case where the program outcomes were quite impressive. Most people agree. And I'll also, if I have time, I think I might, summarize the one national effort. Again, most things were done at the local level, but there was a national planning effort that I may have time to emphasize before I conclude. All right, so let me talk then about participatory action research. There was a special unit of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics that featured 59 rural sociologists. I don't know how many rural sociologists there are in the Economic Research Service today or in USDA, but I know there are not 59 rural sociologists in USDA today. So this was the high point of social science, especially non-economic social science in the Department of Agriculture. And they were basically community organizers. Again, they pioneered, they innovated all of these programs. They thought in order for citizens to have a voice, they needed to be organized at the local, county, even neighborhood level. So the first thing they did when this program was initiated in a given county, any given county, was that rural sociologists would go out and start working with local citizen farmers to identify the local rural community. What are the boundaries of your particular neighborhood in this county? Now, this was not, we do talk about this in sociology today, sort of theoretical terms, what is community and so on. But for them, this was not an abstract theoretical question. The idea is what sub-county unit, what spatial unit of the county should be represented on the County Planning Commission. So it's a very practical concern. How do you divide up a county to have true representation of everybody that lives in the county? So that was the goal of the rural sociologist working with farmers, was to identify, establish the boundaries around the socio-spatial areas to be represented on the community committees aggregating to the county level. This was called community delineation, kind of a funny term. That's what they called it, delineating a county. Again, the goal was for equal representation of everybody in the county by community, citizen participation on these local land use planning committees. Now, in the late 30s and early 40s, rural sociologists and farm people delineated or identified, isolated on paper, 1,800 communities and 11,000 rural neighborhoods across 32 states. So this is a summary of the extent of what these 59 rural sociologists in USDA did with local people, identifying 11,000 rural neighborhoods across 32 states. These are mapped neighborhoods of the county with local folks. Some of the maps are in Steenbach Library. They're on campus. They're these big scale maps, and they're breaking a county down by community. Now, since the rural sociologists were working with knowledgeable local farm people, they realized that what they were doing was simply a formalization of folk knowledge. That is, local people who lived in a county for decades or their whole lives had a sense of what the different counties were, different communities were within the county. So the idea was to map it, to make it plain, to make it, allow it to be discussed. Is this the best way to organize the county? So another way it was referred to is, again, combining the scientific expertise of sociologists with the common sense of the local farmers. Let's see, Sarah, how much more time do I have here? Let's see, it's 10 till 3 about, right? So
Yeah, you got another 12-ish, 13-ish minutes.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Perfect. That's just right. I will take up most of that time, it appears. So the final big thing I want to do here is to give you an example of what the effects of this planning program were. One county, a very poor biracial county in Georgia, a plantation area, heavily eroded, very poor plantation, southern black and white county called Greene County in Georgia, was studied by a rural sociologist named Arthur Raper. He was assigned by this agency, the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, the Rural Sociology Division, to study the effects of the program. So basically he was doing program evaluation. He moved there with his family for 2.5 years, lived in the county, participated in all of sorts of activities. His kids went to school there, lived there 2.5 years, and spent all of his days and half the nights talking to people about what are the effects of this county. It's a very big book that he published in 1943. It's called Tenets of the Almighty, a phrase by a local person in the county. And it details, the second half of that book details at great length what the impact of this program was. I just want to mention a few things that were impressive about the county. First of all, 80% they determined through the research with soil scientists and others, 80% of the land in the county was heavily eroded. So the first thing they did was set up one of these newfangled governmental entities called a soil conservation district. Again, organized on a cooperative basis of citizens working with the technicians of the Soil Conservation Service to address the physical needs of soil and water conservation. They put in cover crops, they put in terraces, all sorts of conservation structures, and so on. But in Greene County, this Cooperative Land Use Planning Committee went far beyond technical fixes and addressed social issues. Landlord-tenant relations was one thing, and rural poverty. So they requested and received significant federal assistance, mainly through the Farm Security Administration, this agency that specialized working with poor families in rural areas. So the Farm Security Administration originally in 1938 had one administrator, one supervisor in the parish. Within 3 years, there were 12 professionals of this agency whose job it is to work with local farmers and citizens, including a Black home economist and a Black farm manager. So resources poured in from the federal government to see what could be done in a very poor place. And this was not done everywhere by any means. This was an exemplary experiment to see what could be done if resources were forthcoming. Canning was a major thing among farm women. Pressure cookers were made available through the Farm Security Administration. In 1939, the average canning quarts put up by the farm women of fruits and vegetables was 12 quarts per household. 3 years later, it was 499. So imagine the nutritional gain from 12 quarts of canned fruits and vegetables to 499. Arthur Raper was incredibly impressed with the gains made here. Healthcare cooperatives were set up. Originally in 1938, there were 150 members, family members of the local medical co-op set up by the Farm Service, by the Farm Security Administration. Within 3 years, 515 families were members of the co-op, where doctors, local doctors, would make house visits, which they had rarely done before, especially to poor people's houses. Again, this medical cooperative was paid into, and the doctors were glad to provide the services, although the AMA was not so glad about it and attacked the program, as you can imagine. I'll just very briefly mention other areas of social life that saw incredible increases in well-being through Greene County that Arthur Raper documents in great detail. Education, housing, recreation, forest fire prevention, CCC camps, all of these things were made possible, organized, coordinated by this Cooperative Land Use Planning Committee of Greene County. So again, it stands out because it, number one, is documented. Number two, it got special resources, but hundreds of other counties realized this last phase of unified action, it was called, of getting action from the planning effort. Most impacts were local. I think maybe I'll just mention right before the conclusion, there was one national effort done in early 1941 of representatives of each state, over 700 farm people, total nationwide, worked with about 2,000 technicians from various agencies of the USDA to plan for the post-war recovery. The US wasn't even in the war yet. This is the summer of 1941, but it knew it would be in it eventually. And so they planned and proposed what should happen in the post-war recovery, so to speak. Healthcare, nutrition, housing, public works, hospitals, community centers, recreation. There's a special effort made of education for farm workers to improve their working conditions, the extension of Social Security and minimum wages to farm workers, the labor camps, again, that Steinbeck writes about in Grapes of Wrath, vocational education, trade schools, even the proposal for cultural exchanges between the rural Americans and Latin America. On agricultural policy in particular, let me just summarize by saying the proposal of this national planning effort was strong support for family-sized farms, not to disproportionately benefit larger farms, but to funnel the resources toward encouraging a family-sized farm. Yeah, let me just leave it at that for now. So let me conclude. So as you can gather from what I'm saying, this program had a funny name, Cooperative Land Use Planning, but it really is what we would call today rural development. That name and the concept did not exist at this time. These guys in the Department of Agriculture created this field of rural development and community development. These terms and concepts did not exist in the late 1930s, but by the 1950s, they did exist, especially in international work, in land reform work in Japan and the Philippines and elsewhere in the mid 40s after World War II and in the 1950s and 60s. So it really is rural development by another name. New ways of organizing groups and communities for social change. Local people turned into effective, deliberative bodies for action, or community organizing is another way to put it. Again, this was internationalized, oddly enough, often by these very people. M.L. Wilson and Howard Tolley spent years in India and Pakistan and all over the world. These young rural sociologists, as they were aging, and ag economists, this is the beginning of post-war international development that use these ideas from the New Deal, again, in land reform, community development, rural development. I just want to emphasize that this is a state-led reform, right? It's an attempt to democratize society through the state. And we have examples of this throughout American history. In fact, I think it's basically the only way that positive social change, social reform really happens, is a combination of state and civil society groups. One way to put it is combining bottom-up initiatives with top-down resources. Examples of this, of course, are Reconstruction after the Civil War, the labor movement of the 1930s, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the war on poverty of the 1960s, the Medicare, Head Start. All of these are combined efforts of local citizens and federal agencies. There's a nice term I like that, again, Max Weber would not appreciate, would not agree with, but it's the idea of heroic bureaucracies. Heroic bureaucracies. The Farm Security Administration is an example of that. The Office of Economic Opportunity, community health centers from the 1960s, Head Start. These are heroic bureaucracies that try to democratize society. Let me just say in closing, again, Henry Wallace, M.L. Wilson, Howard Tolley, and the others thought that a democratizing state was indeed possible. In fact, they saw it. That's the way they interpreted the programs I've been talking about. You know, it was not a philosophical issue, it was not a theoretical issue, but it was a means of engaging local citizens to work on local problems with federal resources. Again, a combination of bottom up, top down. Too many of my old New Left friends talk only about bottom up, and many young radicals talk only about bottom-up initiatives. But I think for true social change to happen, you have to have both. You have to have bottom-up and top-down, not either or, but a third way, a combination of these. I think I'll stop with that. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Jess. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. So great to hear you present that to us and provoke our thoughts. So what we're going to do now is the Agroecology 702 students are going to take on the organization here. We brainstormed a list of questions in class on Tuesday, so they're going to pick just a couple of those for maybe about 10 minutes, get your responses, and then we'll open up the floor to the whole group. And for Claire, do you want to tell us now how you're going to organize that, or wait till after they do our questions? What do you think?
I'm thinking we'll wait until after our questions to do that, so that no one gets confused.
Okay, all right. So we'll move it to the student 702 questions for about 10 minutes. And then you'll get some further instructions, and there'll be lots of time for people to chime in here. So go for it, 702 students.
Okay, so just so everyone knows that we brainstormed these before the lecture, but we did all read the book. So that's just context for these questions. So our first question is, we have heard a lot recently about President Biden's infrastructure plans and the Green New Deal. What comparisons do you make between the intended New Deal of the 30s and early 40s and what we are seeing today?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Of course, the whole use of the term Green New Deal, right? They did that on purpose. They knew what they wanted to refer back to, this massive reform effort of the 1930s. Well, I think there's some general principles. I don't have any specific insight into the Green New Deal. Many people here in the audience probably have more than I do and may be working more directly in that connection. But I think there are some general principles that should be kept in mind. One is what I just mentioned. It should not be solely a top-down effort. Right? You've got to have local citizen participation in whatever these programs are, climate control and so on. And there's a lot of lessons, I think, in this program of what worked and what didn't work. I probably presented it as if everything was fine and there are no problems in the 1930s, but that definitely was not the case. In the book, I detail lots of problems with these programs. But the general principle of involving local citizens to form public policy and to reform it, to keep having this feedback mechanism, I think that's a principle that has got to be integrated into a Green New Deal. The related point is all aspects of the program, administration, adult education, research, applied research, policymaking, planning. Again, it needs to be an integrated approach to the issue being addressed. So I've tried to do some reading, but haven't found a lot about specifically agricultural parts of the Green New Deal. If some of you students that were asking the question, have you found many concrete proposals having to do with the Green New Deal in relation to agriculture specifically?
Come on, students, answer his question. Come on.
I've seen a lot of talk about re-implementing the AAA policies, parity pricing and supply management in particular.
Yeah, well, that's a big issue. I mean, we have it in a way, there's subsidies that go out, but there's not a lot of controls and mechanisms in the current Farm Service Agency, I think. Yeah. The main thing I've read about, again, I'm not an expert on the Green New Deal, is the climate issues. And of course, that's very important, but I just haven't heard a lot about the specifics of as applied to agriculture and rural America. I think one more thing to keep in mind, I didn't talk about this at all. I end the book by addressing this point, is that these are all heavily controversial and political issues, and we should not forget that there are enemies of democracy who will fight these programs. They fought them in the 1930s and 40s, and they will fight them today. And they're very powerful. And in fact, they defeated the program. I didn't give the bad, sad story that the cooperative land use planning program was actually ended suddenly in the middle of 1942 by Congress. It said an anti-New Deal Congress just ended the program. So it lived a short 3 years. So we should never forget that there are powerful political enemies fighting democratization, and they often win. So that's of course that's no news to any political activist, but it needs to be kept in mind, I think.
Okay. Thank you so much. And we have our next question is, the book talked about agrarian democracy, but it was not inclusive. It was a white man and mainstream actors, like those are the main actors. How does our recognition of the massive racial inequalities in our society, both then and now, fit with the agrarian democratic dream portrayed in the book and in the lecture?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. It's absolutely true. Agrarian democracy historically has been limited by and large to white people. There's the whole Black land grant agricultural system, the school of the 1890s, that in at least one in every southern state, there's a Black land grant college that is in this agrarian tradition. I've actually done some writing about an alternative Black agrarianism that's emphasizing fighting racial inequality and overcoming white supremacy. So I think the way democracy has generally worked over the centuries and over the decade, starting out as a small elite in ancient Greece, let's say, but over the centuries, gradually expanding to include other classes, other races, other, beyond white men. So I think the ideals of democracy laid out by the agrarian intellectuals, I think are sound. Our task is to expand that to make it more inclusive, to include other races and other people who have been excluded. So I think it's just it's a matter of continual expansion. You know, like John Dewey said, the answer to democratic problems is more democracy, more expansion. In a class example would be to have an extension service for farm workers, for example, right? So is there more? I mean, that's my general reaction. There may be an implied criticism or question as to whether this notion of agrarian democracy can be expanded. Is that, did anybody, any of the students want to elaborate on that point? In other words, is it by nature, is it in principle limited to white men, say? Or is it in principle expandable? What's your view of that? Students.
I would think that in theory, at least, it should be expandable. I don't know if how it would be in the constructs that we have put our society in, but I think people are people, so it should be expandable.
I think sometimes the notion of like equitable land redistribution can be a sticky one when you get into sort of democratic participation by other people who do own land, and that doesn't mean it's not surpassable, but I think that would be the stickiest point.
Well, that's a very sticky point, because land is, you know, what's the saying, they're not making anymore. So it's a finite, at least good land, farmland is effectively limited. You can drain swamps and make more, so to speak, but it's not infinitely expandable the way capital or industrial production is. Land is, agriculture is limited by and large by the physicality, the spatial expanse of land. And so, say in a given county, you know, you've got X number of acres. Yeah, who owns it and farms it? It's a limited number of people that can do that. So that of course is the whole idea behind land reform. And a radical democratic stance on land reform, remember my definition, is the increase of resources and power to non-elites, or the redistribution of resources, primary among which in rural America is land, is still land. So, you know, it was an issue after the Civil War with the 40 acres and a mule, and it's been an issue ever since. Who owns the land and what kind of power does that confer in local affairs? And we know in rural America, even in an industrialized society like ours, in rural areas especially, big landowners still have disproportionate power, and they're almost always white. You know, there's a literature on Black farmers and Black landowners, but it's a very small proportion of all of the farmland in the country. And of course, the number of Black farmers since the 1920s has been drastically cut down, and drastically, you know. But the other thing I do, in addition to this historical academic research, is work with some Black farm groups in the South. Maybe you can tell by my accent. I don't know if Wisconsin, 30 years in Wisconsin made me lose my Southern accent or not, but I'm from Louisiana. And the other thing I'm involved in today is working with Black farm groups in Mississippi and Louisiana, trying to figure out how to preserve a resource of land on the one hand and use it to the help of the local community, how it can be beneficial to local community development. But other comments and questions on this would be very welcome.
If no one has any comments or questions, this is like at the end of the time for our student questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire and she'll explain how the rest of the discussion is going to go.
Yeah, this is getting exciting. So the method we've chosen to kind of facilitate this discussion is called the progressive stack. So if people have a question and they want to ask it out loud, they can go to the chat and just type out stack like this. And I will add them to a running list of people. And that way we can all take turns and everyone knows whose turn it is to speak and no one has to worry about talking over someone else. And if you don't want to ask your question out loud, you can type stack and then just type in your question. Like that. And that will help me to see who's in stack and who's just like chatting in the chat. Because I know some people like to just put little comments in there and that's totally okay. But having stack before your question will help me see that your question should be asked out loud. And since we didn't have any questions in the chat during the lecture, I guess we could start with Michelle's question. Are you working with Jahi Chappelle?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, that's a question to you.
Yeah, repeat the name, please.
I am afraid I'm mispronouncing it, but it's Jahi Chappelle.
Jahi Chappelle, Food First. He was there for a while and now has left. You
Yeah,
know him?
no, I do not. Tell me what, if either the, is that Michelle Miller asking the question?
Yep, that's me.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. It's so nice to have you close.
Yeah, it's great to hear you, if not see you. So tell me something about the person you're mentioning.
Sure. He's a wonderful, I believe, sociologist, biologist, perhaps. And he, after Food First, he went to be executive director at SAFON, which is the Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network.
Okay.
And he's based in Durham, North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
I'll send you his. We'll have Sarah send you his information. I think she's got it too.
Yeah, thank you. I have heard of Saffron, but I don't know him specifically. I work, over the decades, mainly I'd say with the Federation of Southern Co-ops, which is a long civil rights organization, still going, and their local co-ops in Mississippi. But I know there's lots of, especially recently, the last 10 years, lots of things have sprung up for sure. So thanks for that contact.
All right. Yes, thank you for that. Next in the stack is Douglas.
Hi, Jess.
Hi, Doug. How are you, man?
I'm doing well, man. I'm doing well. It's wonderful to see you and hear you. And I'm down here in Texas. So,
Okay.
So what you didn't cover in the book, and of course, probably my favorite chapter is the last chapter, which is the dark chapter, the purge.
Yeah.
And so basically they get sideways with politics. And as you said, a new administration gets elected, a new Congress, and pretty much it all comes to a screeching halt. So I'd like you to think a little bit about, because a similar thing I would argue happened about 4 or 5 years ago. right before Trump. As Trump comes in after Obama and Kathleen Merrigan start trying to do some similar things. And then we get the ERS and NIFA relocated out of DC, and the attack on science, and they go to Kansas City. And would you talk about that a little bit, about these recurring sort of patterns and themes across history?
Yeah, good point. Is Danielle Berman still here? Danielle?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, Danielle. Are you still with ERS?
No.
Oh.
No, I'm at OMB.
Oh, okay. I see.
So she went sideways and avoided it. I mean, a lot of people went sideways, right, Danielle?
Yes, a lot of people did. I was actually at the Food Nutrition Service at USDA, but I know and worked with a lot of people at ERS who scrambled to find other positions or, left the government entirely. So it decimated the research community within USDA.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have any special knowledge of it, but Doug, you're exactly right. I mean, there are these parallels that repeat themselves. Remember, Walter Goldschmidt in his studies in the early 40s was not allowed to publish the research. The Department of Agriculture would not publish it. The whole Bureau of Agricultural Economics, the agency that supported this effort I've been talking about, was basically gutted. It was destroyed, literally destroyed in 1953, but even during World War II, it ran into political opposition, as you said, especially against Southern plantation owners, because they did studies showing that cotton, is a global commodity and is not going to stay in the Southeast anymore. It's going to move southwest, as of course it did to California and so on, West Texas. So yeah, there are these controversies throughout, and even in rural sociology, in our discipline, until the post-war period, because of these purges, as you said, and I don't think that's too strong a word, because of the anti-communism. Now, I hasten to add, none of these people were communist or even socialist, but they were collectivist, right? Their thinking was not individualistic. They had this notion of community development. They had this idea that rural sociologists at Cornell developed, the community idea, the social control, not in a negative sense, but the control going from the individual to the social unit, broader to society. And, individualist or capitalist or conservative politicians don't want that, and these people got fired. I mean, that's one saving grace of the international development. They could work abroad and talk about land reform in Japan and in India and throughout the third world, but not here at home. So I think this recent attack, breaking up the Economic Research Service, which is the follow-on agency to the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, right? It was recreated in the 1960s under Kennedy. So, but yes, it's an ongoing sad story. You're right. I didn't want to talk about it today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next in the stack is Mike Bell. Because he typed his question out, I'm going to read it out loud. This is another question for you, Jess. Was there any explicit use of anarchist thought in these rural democratization of the state efforts, such as Kropotkin or Emma Goldman?
Yeah. Hi, Mike. Thanks for the question.
Hey, Jess. So great to hear your talk.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
to see your face and hear your voice. All of that.
Yes, great to see you. No, I think the short answer is not. As far as I know, it was very American focused. M.L. Wilson, again, sort of the theorist of democracy in the Department of Agriculture, #2 person, undersecretary. And then in 1940, he became director of the Federal Extension Service. So the #1 person in extension for the next 12 years to 1952, before he went to India. It probably was partly a political decision to focus on American traditions, right? So they thought they had enough to draw on from a radical interpretation of Thomas Jefferson, equality and all of that. The legacy of the populist, among whom were their fathers and mothers, you know, in Iowa. I didn't say all of these people are from Iowa. For some reason, family farm kids from Iowa. And the radical American thought. They thought John Dewey was radical enough, right? And George Herbert Mead and Charles Beard, the history, and Ruth Benedict and Robert Lind. These are radical thinkers that they absorbed. Thorstein Veblen was a big influence on Henry Wallace and Carl Taylor, the rural sociologist. So I think for political purposes, if nothing else, they emphasize the radical or progressive American tradition of political reform. And of course, as you know, as politicians and bureaucrats, that probably made the most sense. But even, you know, I've read their unpublished papers and letters and lots of stuff about them. And anarchism per se, I don't think ever came up. But it's a good question, and there's probably American versions of it, right? But not the European intellectual tradition, at least.
Well, Emma Goldman she immigrated from Russia, but she spent 40 years writing here.
Yeah.
But no, I think you're saying, yeah, it was mainly probably urban focused and wasn't taken up by the Agrarian Intellectuals. Quite interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Ignore my second question, by the way, which you already answered.
Oh, okay.
It's in the chat. Don't worry about it. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Great. Our next question comes from Fred. Fred, do you want to ask your question?
Hello. Yeah, so it actually is related to the question that Mike just pulled and overlaps a hair with Mike's first question. So you can just answer it to the extent that there's additional thoughts on it. And so as you're more aware of than I am, I'm sure the critique from the left, and in particular from the socialist left in the New Deal era, is that the ability of the New Deal to get any kind of even momentary consensus reflected the desperation of the right, and that they were trying to salvage whatever they could out of a capitalist system, and that there was conceivably a moment when something more sweeping could have changed. And so the critique goes that as well-intentioned as the New Deal was, that it was sort of unintentionally the football of the right, to kind of change the direction things were going. And I'll attach, because it's related, a sidebar to that. So I'm good friends with Loka Ashwood, who's the latest generation of those going forth sociologically from Wisconsin here. And she's a little bit darker, in her book from a few years ago here about salvaging the state and so forth. And I even looked up here, she writes, letting the moral economy of democracy reign requires escaping the clutch of the state, which has failed the democratic ethos. She's very dark sometimes, But I'm just curious, I'm sympathetic, the New Deal resonates very strongly with me, this agency work resonates strongly, but how do we react to the concern that maybe we need to sink the whole, the whole attempt and go more radical?
Yeah, well, it is related to Mike's question, I think, on anarchism in a way, especially bringing up Loka. Well, I just have a different point of view. I know Loka quite well and read her book more than once. I just disagree. I think, I'm more hopeful looking at the history, the long history of progressive reform in the country that I mentioned earlier. Reconstruction, the radical side of Thomas Jefferson. There's a slave owning side of Thomas Jefferson, but the Declaration of Independence can be read as quite a radical document at the founding of the country. And then the free soil movement, the free labor movement, which led to the land grant system, from the 1830s and 40s, once the South was out because the Civil War, was out of Congress, the land grant system could be created and Lincoln could sign it. And then Reconstruction, populist, progressive reforms that really, the radical versions of those came out of populism, and they were moderated and passed by Congress in the progressive era. But, in income tax, I don't need to go into the details, the 1930s reforms and the 60s reforms, I guess it is just a political call. But I tend to have hope and see that I think it is the case. I would argue, at least, as I've just hinted at, that progressive change happens and, is happening. Otherwise, what do you do? Now it is, that's not to say that there should not be fierce critiques of the state. There certainly should be, but I just can't agree with the sort of Jim Scott, anarchist, anti-statist position. I just think it's too one-sided, and it's not hopeful. Doesn't do us much good. But I'd be glad, there's lots of people here. I see Neil Flora and others who have considered opinions on these for lots of thinking on it. What's your opinion? Thanks for the question.
Appreciate the discussion.
Well, if I can break in, I think there is a role for the state. I think that there has to be a mechanism for formalizing norms and standards into rules and regulations that are then enforced. And our problem in much of rural areas now is, for example, environmental rules and standards are not enforced. We have depopulated those agencies, just as we're depopulating ERS by moving it. And there is that role for a state, but this is the bottom-up piece of it. The state has got to make those rules based on the norms and values of local, real people, rather than major corporations.
Yeah. And that is, I don't know that Loka Ashwood, for example, would disagree with that, because she's very localist, right? Like Jim Scott. And it's anti-corporations that she's railing against in her book. The state, but also corporations, right? The nuclear energy business there. So yeah, other comments? I'm no isolated expert here. So what do other people think? There's certainly folks with good points of view on these questions.
Well, I didn't hear anybody talk. So back to these swings in history. I think we're in a period now where a lot of us see the state successfully captured by certain interests that turn it into more of a dark force than a light force. I'll put it that way. And actually, I've written a little bit about it. I've been using the Star Wars analogy, the Empire Strikes Back. That's the phase we're in right now. We're in the Empire Strikes Back phase, where the success of the progressive movement is under systematic attack on almost all fronts. And that, you know, so I am hopeful, and this is the job of you graduate students, by the way.
Yes.
Who have to be the Ewoks, basically, or, you know, part of the rebellion as we age, because history will swing. And that's, I think, what Jess is doing here. History will swing back. It is a dark time. And, you know, and the 4 years just previous to this, I think, was a very good look. And, you know, an attempt to really capture the state and do some hammering. And we survived that. I was ready to leave the country if the election was different. I mean, I was warning my son, I'm leaving the country. Either that, I'm going to go to jail or kill or somebody will get killed. So, but that didn't happen. So we need to be hopeful for a while now that something can happen under this administration, and maybe the pendulum will swing back toward a more progressive agenda. That's my hope. And, you know, sort of like those 59 rural sociologists, it is the job of these students now coming out, you know, to help make that happen.
Yeah.
Cool. We do have one more question in the stack.
Brad's hand is up too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just follow on this last point and the earlier question that Jess raised about what's in the Green New Deal with respect to agriculture. And I think the answer is it's very much up for grabs, but the way it's being pulled down to the ground by mainstream agriculture is to get paid for carbon sequestration in some form or another that's probably not going to do us much good. And so I think we need to wrestle hard to pull it back to the multifunctionality of agriculture and to be thinking about agricultural systems for their full array of impacts, including, but not exclusive to, carbon sequestration, because that's going to let the ag system off cheap. Interestingly enough, right before the election, I went to look at Biden's agricultural package, and that looked like 2012 or 08 rebaked with biofuels and stuff like that. So that made me kind of sick to my stomach at that point, because I was like, what? I mean, biofuels aren't even a going concern in the energy markets. So we're going to dump a bunch of money back into more corn production. So I think we have a ways to go, both because I don't think the Biden administration was coming in on the right foot. And I think the mainstream ag interests see a chance to kind of get off scot-free by pretending to do carbon sequestration and getting paid for it.
Yeah.
That's actually kind of one of my topics of research. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that thought. So our last question in the stack, people can always add more questions, comes from Shoshana. And the question is, when doing bottom slash top down work, how do we address the dark side of community and exclusion on the practical level? Were there lessons learned from your research? And this is a question for you, Jess.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I remember reading, it might have been with Mike Bell and some of our discussions, you know, critiques of the idea of community, because it's, in some sense, it's exclusive, right? It's not only geographically limited, but, and it's analogous maybe with citizenship. there's lots of positive talk about citizenship and citizen participation, but the very notion of citizen and the very notion of community, I think, although Mike, again, as an expert, may want to weigh in on this, is that there's some exclusion involved, or at least that's an argument. And that's, of course, the basis of the question, that not everybody is in, right? But I kind of go back, my first reaction would be to repeat what I said about the race question. I think the second question that I got here is to ever expand the inclusion. And that, race, class, etc. That's my first take on it, that, community can expand, but it's got to be an open and welcome and inclusive community, or at least working in that direction. But the questioner may have a more specific thing in mind. I would be glad to hear.
Maybe I'll just add very quickly the thought that another challenge is that communities are not necessarily set up on a principle of if you like, a horizontality of power, but communities also can be formed in a very hierarchical, if you like, functionalist way, where, some people's job is to be on the top and some people's job is to be on the bottom for the good of the community. So not only the boundary problem, but also a hierarchy problem sometimes within how community is conceived. Alas.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
This is Shoshana, and sorry, I'm trying to garden before get my elderberries in before the rainstorm comes, so I'm listening in the yard. But I think my question was really kind of also getting at this idea of values and how we assume that communities have these positive values. And I think it's just even what we're seeing today with some of the local foods movement, for example, and community gardens, and we assume that there's this kind of democracy happening. But in some cases around the country, we're seeing these community gardens being built by white nationalists with guns, who are like, when it all hits the fan, we're going to be here. This is going to be our food supply, and we're out here protecting it with guns, right? And so I don't think that for a lot of people we need to fund this through USDA and have these novel communities, this was necessarily their idea of what was going to happen. And so how can you use some of the maybe even power of the federal government, and going back to what Cornelia was saying in terms of being able to have regulation and standards and norms to make sure that things are actually being inclusive and democratic, and not exclusive? Well, I think that's where the top down comes in, right? Rexford Tugwell, who I didn't mention, but was also at the first Undersecretary of Agriculture in USDA in the 1930s. He was a much more seemingly radical person than the agrarians, in that he pushed land reform. He said in the 1930s, the only way rural communities, say in the biracial South, in the racist South, are gonna be democratic is if it's imported from Washington. The point being, the very important point, that decentralization is not democracy. Mm-hmm. Right? Decentralization, because, as Mike said and others, if the community itself is inegalitarian, if it's an unequal community, if there's an aristocratic elite, so-called, in terms of Southern plantation owners, then decentralizing, as the New Deal did, gave them more power, right? So the federal government, you've got all these resources, money,
coming in through the Agricultural Adjustment Administration and other agencies of the New Deal that simply grows the power of the local elites. So that's a real concern. Tugwell, number 2 in the department for a while in the mid-30s, he said you just have to enforce them. I was going to say kill them, and he didn't mean kill them, but you destroy their power. You take their power away, which is a radical thing, you know, involving perhaps land reform of Southern planters. So, you know, this is radical talk. He didn't last terribly long in the New Deal. But this is, you know, this is his view. I mean, so I think it's related, Shoshana. There have to be, and maybe this is what Neil was getting at, Cornelia, there have to be certain norms that are enforced nationwide from the, you know, voting rights, let's say, you know, what an idea. You know, everybody has a right to vote in federal, in elections that are in fact imposed, principles that are imposed in local communities. You know, you can't have Jim Crow laws anymore after the mid-60s, after Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, at least, you know, on the books. And so that's an example, I think, of the long arm of the state coming in to enforce certain principles that local communities have to adhere to. Now, there's all, you know, we all know there's this give and take, and lots of things are slip away. But I think that's the idea. That's one operationalization, so to speak, of the bottom-up, top-down model. It's not all decentralization and local control. As exactly as you're saying, Shoshana, you know, local food movements, you know, are not always light and fluffy.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Just because we have one more person in the stack, and I see Mariel also has her hand raised. I would like to move on to Annalise's question, and then we will finish up with Mariel. Annalise?
Hey, Jess, thank you for the lecture. That was, I've also been doing research. I've also been doing research on the soil conservation movement, more from the agricultural standpoint, but I thought that was, and I was really reading a lot from that same time period. So I thought it was really interesting that you identified that period from about 1938 to 1942. And I ran across one story about one of these planned community demonstration projects in Tennessee, where they had like the canning, like you were talking about, and all the community projects, and supposedly it was going really well. And then one day everybody came home to their houses to find eviction notices on their door because the military was taking the land over to build what turned out to be Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as part of the Manhattan Project. And wow. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how World War II maybe was part of the reason why this ended when it did.
Yeah, very good question. Yes, I remember Jane Addams, I think it was, not the social worker from Chicago, but the anthropologist from Southern Illinois, taught me wars are generally anti-democratic, right? They concentrate power. And so you're exactly right. And you know, if you've studied the period, it's the early in World War II is when all of the progressive aspects of the New Deal were destroyed. in agriculture, even before the cooperative land use planning program was destroyed, the Farm Security Administration, this land reform effort for poor farmers and the John Steinbeck stuff and all that, which did some amazing work, I think, in those areas, it was just killed, right? And so, and it's, back to the sort of general question, I like to think about it is it's a political question. The New Dealers, the guys I'm writing about, were defeated politically. That is, conservative Southern Democrats and conservative Midwestern Republicans formed in 1942 an anti-New Deal Congress. And of course, in our system, that means the resources, the money. And so they just stopped funding. They said, no money shall be used for community land use planning. Explicitly, that's written into the legislation. So the program ended. And the Farm Security Administration, in even a bigger way, it's replaced in 1946 by the Farmers Home Administration for returning veterans. So a shadow of its former self. But yes, in general, your point, I fully agree. War usually is not good for a democracy. It's when things are ended, the state gains power and the seemingly overwhelming effort to win the war lets many things fall by the wayside. That was a major rationale for attacking the cooperative land use planning program and for ending the Farm Security Administration, is that, they're contrary to the war effort. We need to save money. And so, since we're in a war, we can't afford these things. But do you have any additional insight about that? You say you're working on the soil conservation projects.
Yeah, I was not looking at policy as much as at like actual methods that they were using, because I was looking at it for more, and also I was looking at the organization Friends of the Land, which was formed by some of these people that you were talking about, and then also businessmen, doctors, all sorts of different people. And so they were the ones that actually visited this place in Tennessee, like right when all this was happening, and were shocked to discover that it had been taken over by the military.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think Henry Wallace and maybe Tugwell and Russell Lloyd, I know the journalist, was a major figure in the Friends of the Land. So, and Aldo Leopold, is Kurt still here? Aldo Leopold, I think, might have been involved in that as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good point to keep in mind, and part of the general point about political enemies, right? And they strike when they can, and they're powerful, and they often win, as Doug and others say. But I mean, to me, it's just that, you have to keep trying. What did Gramsci say?
Pessimistic of mind, optimistic of will.
Yeah, exactly. Optimism of the will. Yes. Pessimism of the intellect. So, I mean, it's a choice you make. I mean, how do you want to live? How do you want to spend your time? For what purpose? So I think progressive political and other change is, the way to go. And it varies. I mean, it certainly swings up and down, pro and con, but I think just have to keep fighting, basically, is my root position.
Thank you for that. I just in case, I saw Mril had her hand raised, so I want to give her a chance to ask her question. But we are nearing the end of our 2 hours.
I can keep it super short. I just wanted a chance to say how much I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really enjoyed your book, Jess. It's been foundational as I've kind of come back to CIAS. I just wanted to also comment about conflict and how conflict is such an elemental piece of the democratic churning, and that I don't think, in terms of sort of learning from the past and thinking about these tools like mediation and conflict resolution, I think there's a lot of tools that we do not have to reinvent, but we really have to kind of take conflict we have to revisit it and figure out how to embrace it and make it part of how we go forward, because it's inevitable. And as you one of the things I read in the Stevenson Clemmy article about the beginning of the CAC for CIAS is that the point of that was to continuously seek critics. So you're looking for conflict, you're looking for criticism, and how you embrace that and bring it in, it clearly helps, I think, do all that, but we can't be afraid of it. Anyway, I so appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree entirely. That's right. That's why there should be a big diversity of opinion in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, right? In-house critics. And that's good. That's what everybody needs.
Yeah.
All right, that is the end of our time and the end of our stack. So that worked out pretty well. Unfortunately, we didn't get to our hangout session that we had planned, but if you want to speak to that at all, Sarah.
Yeah, well, this has been wonderful. It's been great that everyone has been here. And we know that many people have other meetings and class and things to go to. I will stop the recording, but if people want to hang out, I can hang out, but no one has to feel obligated to hang out. But thank you, Jess. Let's give Jess a round of applause.